All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mackenzie. I will be doing the UNESCO lecture on the Vatican. The Vatican typically goes under three names, either the Vatican, Vatican City, or the Holy See. It is the center of Christianity since the foundation of St. Peter's Basilica by Constantine in the 4th century. The Vatican has played an important, not necessarily an important role, but the popes living there have played an important role in the reform or reformation of Christianity, specifically after Rome has fallen. One of the best quotes I found while doing my research that I really liked that talked about reform, I found in an ebook, and it states, "The history of Catholicism also shows in the recognition of the imperfect nature of the Church in this life, despite its equal conviction that the Church, as the rule of faith has it, is one, holy, Catholic, and universal. There was an equal determination to reform the life of the Church, to cleanse it of its most conspicuous failings, and to call it back to its mandate to be the visible presence of Christ on this earth. It saw this as a duty given by its apostolic teaching. One way to say it is that the Church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, but it can always be more unified, more holy, more universal, and more faithful to the apostolic preaching." That was kind of the idea during this time of Reformation in the Church. And this is kind of the idea that I want you to focus on during this lecture while you're thinking about the Lualdi sources and while you're kind of watching and learning. Part of the ideas during this time was that the Church could always be more, basically. In every sense, more holy, better, more Christian. And that was kind of the big idea of the time. So the first one we're going to talk about, the first Lualdi source, is St. Ignatius of Loyola. Now, St. Ignatius was originally a soldier in the Spanish army. However, he was wounded at the Battle of Pamplona in 1520. Because of being wounded in battle, he ended up having to be taken kind of out of the battle and recovered in a monastery. This monastery was found at Montserrat. It was here that he kind of found his religion. He couldn't do much because of his wound, so he was surrounded by things like books of that talked about religion. He was surrounded by all these people that were extremely religious. After he ended up recovering, he did go to the University of Paris, where he and his friends studied and vowed to travel to Jerusalem. The Jerusalem trip, unfortunately, didn't work out, so he and his friends went to Italy instead, where they founded the Society of Jesuits. The society was officially recognized in 1540 by Pope Paul III. This is one of the different kinds of reformations that occurred during this time, one of the breakings off of Christianity. And then St. Ignatius ended up dying in 1566, but was later canonized by the church in 1622. Next is John Calvin. John Calvin actually went to the same university in Paris with Loyola from 1533 to 1534. He became a part of the Reformation movement, but unfortunately, the Reformation movement not everyone was gung-ho about it. Because of that, there were people that were kind of hands-off, but not necessarily in a non-violent way. If they knew you were part of the reform, oftentimes you could get mauled, attacked. So because of that, John Calvin, once he decided to be part of this reform movement, he left Paris. He stopped and settled in Geneva, where he wrote his first edition of his treatise, which is called Institutions of the Christian Religion. It was written in 1536. After he wrote that, he joined forces with Guillaume, I might say this right, Guillaume Farel. Farel and Calvin actually ended up getting kicked out of Geneva because they both were trying to start or establish this religious reform there, but they weren't being the most understanding about it. So they were trying to force people into these new reforms rather than kind of let the people decide for themselves. And so this is one of the parts that I really think are kind of important. Keep in mind that John Calvin fled Paris because he believed in Reformation, and that caused him to be in harm's way. Well, to some degree, I'm not quite sure how much. I couldn't find too much on how much it was or how bad it was, but Farel and Calvin did the same thing. Maybe not to the same degree, but they were described in the Lualdi book as having radical disciplinary measures to kind of get people to reform. And Geneva was not okay with that. After a while, Geneva did end up letting them back in. And that was in 1540. And after that, Calvin continued to try to reform the ideas of the church. Geneva actually ended up becoming a safe place, kind of a refuge for reformists. When they fled other cities for the same reason that John Calvin did, it was known that Geneva was a safe place that they could go. So with that in mind, here are the things that I think you should pull away from this. The Pope ruled over the Papal States. He basically answered to no one. With that in mind, this reform was specifically led by the people, and it wasn't like they had, for the most part, anyone to answer to, so they couldn't, stop it, if that makes sense. People wanted reformation, is a big thing, too. Again, under this idea that the church can always be better. Not in the sense of, have more followers or anything like that, but it can be more Christian. It can believe in a better God. It can try to live up to this idea that we have created under the idea of God, that we are better people, that we are a better society in God's image. Next, it's important to recognize Ignatius of Loyola and his Reformation efforts. He was the founder of the Jesuits, and he was canonized for it. He ended up getting basically congratulated later after he had died for it. And then John Calvin's efforts in Reformation kind of had a little bit of a hard life, having to run around, avoid Paris so that he wouldn't get attacked, get kicked out of Geneva for the same reasons. Well, not for the same reasons, but because he ended up being the attacker, so to speak. But yeah,